Power is not merely the ability to conquer, it is the capacity to endure.
In the 13th century, one empire had perfected the art of conquest on a scale that begared belief. An avalanche of horse and steel that had redrawn the known world.
But how does such a force contend with an enemy that refuses to fight on its terms? How does a hammer strike the wind?
This is the story of a superpower's education in the art of asymmetric warfare.
A lesson delivered by a master strategist and his entire nation. Now, let us open the chronicles of war and bear witness to this clash of empires.
By the mid-1280s, the Mongol Empire, under the reign of the great Khan Kublai, was not merely a regional power, but a global reality.
From the plains of Hungary to the shores of the Pacific, its armies had shattered dynasties and leveled cities.
The Mongol war machine was a testament to disciplined organization and tactical brilliance. Its basic unit, the Tumen of 10,000 horsemen, could project overwhelming force with terrifying speed. Having finally crushed the formidable southern Song dynasty in China, Kublai Khan established his own Yuan dynasty. And his gaze fell south, towards the small but defiant kingdom of Dai Viet. From a geopolitical perspective, Dai Viet was a strategic dagger aimed at the Yuan's newly acquired southern flank.
For Kublai, its subjugation was a matter of imperial consolidation.
But the Vietnamese had already tasted Mongol fury.
A generation earlier, in 1258, a Mongol army under Uriang Khadai had swept through, sacking.
Yet, they had failed to break the kingdom.
The Tran court and its people had simply vanished into the countryside,
denying the invaders a decisive battle and forcing their eventual withdrawal due to heat, disease, and dwindling supplies. This experience became the cornerstone of Dai Viet's national defense.
A doctrine refined and championed by the supreme commander of its armies, Prince Trần Quốc Tuấn, better known to history as Trần Hưng Đạo.
To fight the Mongols on an open field was national suicide.
Their cavalry, numbers, and shock tactics were insurmountable in conventional warfare.
Dai Viet's greatest assets were not its armies, but its terrain and the unbreakable will of its people. The dense jungles, the labyrinthine river deltas, and the oppressive humidity were not obstacles, but allies.
Trần Hưng Đạo formalized
We will evacuate
brutal, yet effective national strategy known as vườn không nhà trống,
or empty gardens, empty houses.
It was a scorched earth policy of staggering commitment.
As the Mongol horde prepared to invade anew in 1285, the order was given. The capital would be abandoned.
Granaries would be burned, wells poisoned, and villages emptied.
The entire population was to become a ghost, melting into the hills and forests.
The invaders would find no food, no shelter, no intelligence, only an empty, hostile land that would bleed their strength day by day. In early 1285, the storm broke.
Against starvation.
A massive Yuan army, commanded by Kublai Khan's son, Prince Toghon, surged across the northern border.
A second force, a veteran naval fleet under the general Scorched, struck from the south, aiming for a classic pincer movement designed to crush Dai Viet between two anvils.
On paper, the strategy was sound, a textbook application of Mongol military doctrine.
The capital, Tanglong, fell quickly, just as it had decades before.
But for Prince Toghon, victory felt hollow. He had captured a ghost town.
The royal court, the army, the very population it governed, had vanished. He had seized the kingdom's royal court, only to find it, the very population it governed, had vanished. What ensued was not a campaign of conquest, but a descent into a logistical nightmare.
Trần Hưng Đạo strategy of vườn không nhà trống now reveal its true genius.
The Mongol army, accustomed to living off the fat of conquered lands, found only ashes. Their vast cavalry, a decisive weapon on the open steppe, was hobbled by the dense jungle and swampy terrain, making them easy targets for guerrilla ambushes.
Every patrol was a gamble. Every supply convoy a desperate race against an unseen enemy.
Who knew every trail and every waterway.
When we analyze this phase of the war, we see a masterful application of asymmetric warfare.
Dai Viet did not need to win battles. It only needed to make the occupation impossibly costly.
They bled the Mongol army one small cut at a time, using harassing raids, night attacks, and the debilitating effects of tropical disease and malnutrition.
The Mongol command structure began to fray.
Scorched's southern fleet managed to push north, but linking with Toghon's starving army proved difficult.
They were two arms of a great beast, flailing in the dark, unable to find a solid body to strike.
It was at this moment of maximum Mongol exhaustion that Trần Hưng Đạo chose to transition from defense to offense.
He had preserved his main forces, waiting for the invader to weaken.
Now, as the monsoon season loomed, threatening to sever Mongol supply lines completely, he struck.
In a series of swift, decisive counter-offensives at strategic river crossings like Chương and Hàm Tử, the Đại Việt forces, appearing as if from nowhere, shattered the dispirited Yuan garrisons.
The Mongol army, stretched, thin, and starving, collapsed.
Prince Toghon was forced into a humiliating retreat, reportedly having to hide in a bronze cask to escape capture.
Kublai Khan, a man who had presided over the conquest of China, could not abide such a defeat.
At the hands of what he considered a minor kingdom.
Your forces have been defeated. Humiliation fueled obsession.
2 years later, in 1287, he launched a third invasion, larger and more powerful than the last. This time, the force was better prepared, accompanied by a massive supply fleet of hundreds of vessels.
The Khan had learned from his mistakes. He would not allow his arm to starve.
The objective was the same: capture the Tran court and decapitate the Vietnamese resistance.
Once again, Toghon was in command, given a chance to redeem his honor.
And once again, Trần Hưng Đạo met him with the same devastating strategy.
Thăng Long was abandoned. The land was stripped bare. The guerrilla attacks resumed.
But this time, we see a subtle shift in Đại Viet's strategic focus.
Trần Hưng Đạo recognized that the Mongol army's center of gravity was no longer its cavalry, but its naval supply line. Cut the fleet, and the army would wither on the vine. The land war became a holding action, a vast and bloody enterprise designed to fix Toron's army in place, to draw out the campaign, and to force it to consume its supplies while the real war was waged against its logistical lifeline.
Mongol raiding parties were ambushed, their foraging attempts thwarted.
The Yuan army was once again trapped in a quagmire, winning skirmishes but losing the war of attrition. Their movements were dictated not by strategy, but by the desperate search for food. Tohon's command faced a strategical paradox. Territorial gains yielded no tactical advantage.
And his army was withering, without a foe to strike.
Historical records paint a picture of deep frustration within the Mongol leadership.
They were fighting an entire nation that had become an army, a landscape that had been turned into a weapon.
As the months wore on, the great supply fleet became Togon's only hope for survival and eventual withdrawal.
The pressure mounted!
With his land forces depleted by disease and incessant attacks, and with the monsoon season once again approaching,
Togon made the fateful decision to retreat.
his only viable path of escape for such a large, broken army and its naval contingent was down the wide mouth of the Dang River.
It was the very route Trần Hưng Đạo had anticipated.
The exact channel into which he had patiently steered the most powerful army on Earth.
The hunter was now being herded, unknowingly, toward the jaws of a meticulously prepared trap.
The Dang River was a place of historical resonance, the site of a previous Vietnamese victory against a...
Trần Hưng Đạo was not just a student of strategy, but of history itself.
For months, his soldiers, in a remarkable feat of military engineering, had planted thousands of massive, iron-tipped wooden stakes into the riverbed.
Invisible at high tide, this forest of submerged spears transformed the wide estuary into a death trap. When we examine the preparation, we see the absolute fusion of environmental knowledge and military planning.
Strategy was contingent on a force of nature, the powerful, predictable tides of the Gulf of Tonkin.
The Mongol fleet entered the river mouth on the morning tide of April 9th, 1288.
Eager to reach the safety of the open sea, they saw a small flotilla of Dai Viet warboats and gave chase.
This was the bait.
The Vietnamese vessels engaged in a masterful feigned retreat, drawing the heavy Yuan warships deeper and deeper into the pre-prepared kill zone.
The Mongol commanders, focused on their prey, failed to notice the subtle markers on the riverbanks, or the quiet patience of the thousands of Vietnamese soldiers hidden in the dense mangroves on either side.
Then, at the precise moment calculated by Trần Hưng Đạo, the tide turned.
As the water level began to fall rapidly, the Vietnamese flotilla turned to attack.
Their smaller, more maneuverable boats, swarming the larger Yuan vessels.
The Mongol fleet, attempting to turn and fight, found itself in a state of horrifying paralysis.
The tide was now an enemy, pulling them backward and downward onto the suddenly revealed iron-tipped stakes. Hulls were pierced, great ships were impaled and immobilized, their momentum turned into a weapon of self-destruction.
The trap had sprung. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter.
The trapped ships became helpless platforms for destruction.
From the riverbanks, interlocking fields of fire from crossbowmen and archers rained down.
Fire rafts were launched into the panicked and congested fleet.
The Mongol force, invincible on the open steppe, was systematically dismantled on the water.
The chronicles tell of the river being blocked with wreckage and bodies.
General Sogetu was killed, and the fleet's commander captured.
The logistical heart of the Yuan invasion was not just severed, it was annihilated.
When news of the disaster reached Prince Togun's struggling land army, it caused a complete collapse in morale. His retreat north became a desperate flight, harried at every step.
The battle is lost!
Kublai Khan's third, and final, attempt to conquer Dai Viet had ended in his empire's most catastrophic naval defeat.
Tran Hung Dao had proven that the myth of Mongol invincibility had its limits. It ended where strategic genius met the unyielding will of a nation fighting for its own soul.
The great campaigns and meticulously engineered battles have long since faded into the mists of the past.
Their sounds silenced by the centuries.
Yet, the strategic lessons of Trần Hưng Đạo and the people of Đại Việt endure.
As a timeless testament to the idea that a nation's true strength is not found in the size of its armies,
its profound connection to its own land.